point of this video is to say something that you already know, but to do it with numbers. To start with, I think that the fundamental premise of civilization is that you protect certain rights and interests of other people in exchange for other people protecting you in the same way. Also, in order for society to be scalable, it seems to me that we need to appoint government officials to represent us. Taking these both together, I figure that the job of these representatives is 1. To research the full diversity of needs and interests of their constituents, then 2. Discuss and debate differing views, positions, and options on how to represent us, because some policy decisions are more rational than others, and finally 3. Vote, because even in good conscience, informed, rational, and respectful people will reach differing conclusions. It's convenient to settle that with a vote, on the assumption that with due diligence, most people will arrive at the better conclusions. Based on that, I propose the following as a maxim. The unique demographics of the representatives should have no bearing on how they represent their constituents. That is, a Latin woman should protect my rights and promote my interests just as well as a white man, because even though skin color, genitals, wealth, and so forth direct the life experiences that shape a person's worldview, representatives are working to inform themselves of a diversity of worldviews so as to represent everyone equally. In theory, a government composed entirely of white men could well be a civilized government if all the representatives duly represent their constituents, omitting the obvious question of how a government could come to be composed of such a narrowly defined demographic. With this in mind, I thought I'd look for a gendered issue to test whether or not our U.S. Congress is a civilized body of representatives. I chose the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which stipulates that employees who discover that their compensation was diminished due to gender will have the legal standing on which to sue their employers for gender discrimination. Whether the law is good or not is immaterial to my test. What I want to see is that the percentage of women who support the bill is within statistical error of the percentage of men who support the bill. Only then are the genitals of our representatives not key factors in their qualification to lead. And again, I am asserting that this is a requisite criteria to being a civilized country. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act was introduced in 2008. It passed the House and failed the Senate. It was introduced again in 2009 and passed both the House and the Senate. I'm looking at just the voting record of the House and the Senate for the year that it passed. That data is shown here. The voting record is easy to find by searching for S-181, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. However, I had to compile the voting record and look up several representatives to determine their genders. Oddly, the votes of one New York senator and one Minnesota senator did not get recorded. I don't know if they were yes, no, or abstain, so I did not include them in the statistics. And the votes to abstain are pragmatically equivalent to the votes against, so I'm counting those as such. Now, 78.7% of women and 54.2% of men voted in favor of the act. At first glance, this looks bad, but remember that even in the ideal case, the percent support from women and men won't ever be exactly equal. They'll fluctuate up and down relative to each other. And we can calculate how much variation to expect based on the number of people and on the results in a particular vote. The standard deviation is equal to the square root of the number of representatives times the fraction who voted yes times the fraction who voted no. And a 95% confidence interval is approximately 2 standard deviations. The derivation for this standard deviation is actually quite impressive and quite unrelated to my point. Suffice to say, the 95% confidence interval for women is 8.4%, and for men it is 4.8%. So, at the very best, no fewer than 11.3% of women and men in Congress are uncivilized representatives. And that's my main point, that based on this simple metric, the United States is not yet a civilized nation. And I think it's rather interesting as a metric to estimate how uncivilized we are. Granting that our representatives are uncivilized, what if their composition were demographically proportional? With women supporting the bill at 78.7% and men favoring it at 54.2%, the overall support should be 66.5%. However, Congress is 82.3% male, and that brings the overall support down to 58.6%. This is a difference of 7.9% from a more representative vote on this particular bill. This is all rather problematic. Consider the limiting worst-case scenario in which all voters and all representatives are uncivilized and only consider their own interests. Then 1, achieving a proportionate body of representatives will not occur naturally. If a majority demographic is voting in all the elections, then each election is determined by that demographic. That is, if 70% of the population is white, and all white people vote for white representatives, then 100% of the representatives will be white. And 2, even if we could achieve proportionate representation, the decisions would be disproportionately determined by the majority group for the same reason. If 70% of the representatives are white, and they're voting on racial issues, then every vote will exclusively represent the white interests. So the solution then is not proportional representation. If we must have uncivilized representatives, then what we want is demographically equal representation regardless of the population. And I'm pretty sure that's untenable. Alternatively, we can work on building a civilized majority of Americans. As described, a simple majority is all we need to put civilized representatives on the ballots and vote them in, resulting in a nearly 100% civilized body of representatives. And that is an achievable goal. It may sound like I'm calling the majority of Americans uncivilized. I am, but that's not an insult. Unlike our politicians, we are not failing to do a job that we professionally signed up to do. Yet, we do need to do better. Most voters are not carefully considering the policy positions and track records of the candidates. We are not diligently debating and weighing the issues. Rather, we are actually avoiding the dinner table conversations that would help us consider other people's feelings, perspectives, interests, and needs on things that really matter. And that's why I'm putting these videos together. I make a point to listen to a diversity of ideas, and these videos are my effort to contribute to the conversations that help us all become more civilized people. So, while the advancement of civilization does require systems-level changes implemented from the top down, we can put people in positions to make those changes and pressure them to do so from the bottom up. And that's all I really wanted to talk about, but there was one other trend I would be remiss to omit. The support of the bill doesn't entirely break down along gender lines. If you look at it by party and gender, 100% of the 70 Democratic women support the bill, whereas 16.7% of the 24 Republican women do. The thing that gives me pause is that Democratic men support the bill at 96.7%, far more than the 16.7% of Republican women, which suggests that the divide may be by party as much as by gender. However, looking at the composition in both the House and the Senate, I note that there were twice as many women, percentage-wise, in the Democratic Party as the Republican Party. So, I figured that if I force equal gender representation, that would simply increase the size of the Democratic Party without actually changing anything about either party. So, I held the percentage of support for each gender overall and within both parties constant, rounded the numbers at the end to the nearest whole, dropped the independent party altogether, and counted the total number of representatives, including the 2 senators whose votes didn't get recorded, for a total of 533 representatives. This is what the theoretically equal representation broken down by party looks like. Note that the only thing that changed about the parties is that the Democratic Party is now much larger. And I want to flip back to that other slide for a second. Somehow it feels that the 3 out of 195 Republican men who voted yes on the bill deserve to be named. And they are Leonard Lance, Christopher Smith, and Ed Whitfield. Also, I would like to point out that this data is from 2009. I have observed that the Republican Party appreciably increased its diversity since then. So, kudos to the GOP.